Good evening, everybody. My name is Peter van Dommelen, and it's my pleasure and my privilege to welcome you all here tonight as the director of the Tchaikovsky Institute for Archaeology and the Ancient World. Welcome you here to Rhode Island Hall, which is the home of the Tchaikovsky Institute here. And more specifically, in fact, of course, welcoming you to the conference that's been organized for us by Felipe Rojas and Jonathan Ben-Dov. I'm pleased to note, in fact, that this is, in fact, for various people, is a welcome back here to the Institute, because as you all will be well aware, the Institute runs a very busy program of seminars, lectures, workshops, one-day conferences, and longer academic events. And I recognize several people here who've been here before on some of these occasions to Rhode Island Hall to participate in one of these events. But my welcome, of course, extends just as much to those colleagues at Brown who've just crossed the road to join us here in Rhode Island Hall, and who in fact do so very often on all kinds of occasions, not just to participate but also to co-organize with us all various of these events. So a very warm welcome indeed. The occasion of today's gathering is itself another reason to really be pleased, because the program that Philippe and Jonathan have prepared is a magnificent example of and a contribution to the ambitions and the mission that we aim to realize here at Rhode Island Hall in and through the Tchaikovsky Institute. Let me just very briefly highlight a couple of points here. The archaeological starting point, of course, the rock cut monuments that we'll be hearing about. The interdisciplinarity of the contributions, archaeological, textual, iconographic. The comparative nature of which we will hear some things immediately tonight, but especially tomorrow, when there will be contributions ranging from Anatolia to Egypt and to Iran. But most of all, or not most of all, last but certainly not least, the educational and the pedagogical dimension that's inherent here as well. Because the conference roots in a seminar, a graduate seminar by the same name that Felipe has been teaching so far this semester and continues to teach, of course. And a seminar that in fact met earlier today, this afternoon, already to discuss these topics. This is in fact a wonderful example how research and teaching go hand in hand and in fact reinforce each other. All in all, therefore, the program that we have for tonight and for tomorrow promises that we're in for a treat, an intellectual treat really of interesting, widely ranging and very intellectually stimulating papers. And I therefore wish you all a wonderful conference and great, exciting debates. Felipe.
Thank you all for being here. And thank you also to the Tchaikovsky Institute, to the Department of Egyptology and Assyriology, and to the George and Florence Weiss Chair of Judaism in the Ancient World at the University of Haifa for funding this conference. Jonathan, with whom I conceived this event, and I would like to express our sincere gratitude to Jessica Porter and to Sarah Sharp for making sure that everything from accommodations to transportation to flyers to tonight's reception actually happened. Finally, thank you to the speakers for accepting our invitation, and again to all of you for joining us. Rock cut monuments are good to think with. They are also good to visit, good to climb, good to rub yourself against when things begin to scratch. Some think they are good to deface and to obliterate. If you ask my colleague, Yanis Hamilakis, he may even try to convince you that they would be pretty good in talk shows. For better or for worse, probably for worse, this is not last week tonight. Amur Harmanshah, a former member of this institute, argued recently that rock-cut monuments are foundational for the study of the ancient Near East because they are some of the first monuments that European explorers and travelers in the region encountered and studied systematically. And thus, these artifacts, along with the landscapes in which they were carved, are very literally the material ground on which Western academic knowledge of the ancient Near East was built. I would argue, however, that they are also foundational more generally, more abstractly, if you wish, as a window into human interaction with what many of us today might call archaeological evidence. Understandably, much attention has been paid to the moment of carving of rock-cut monuments. But as recent research has shown, rock reliefs provide an ideal opportunity to study very long-term engagement between humans and some of the artifacts that they recognize as old. From the Byzantine church complex flanking the upper Hittite relief at Ivris, which you see on screen, to Urartian and Christian inscriptions carved and recarved on Armenian Bronze Age dragon stones. And again, from the intense dialogue between Sasanian and Achaemenid monuments in Nakhchivan to the recent colorful addition of a Kurdish flag on a Neo-Assyrian rock-cut monument, which you have on your handout. Wherever there are rock-cut monuments, there is also abundant evidence that proves that these things have repeatedly incited later observers to respond to them, often in ways that reconceive and re-energize them. Rock-cut monuments belong to a common but a distinct type of archaeological artifact that is characterized by never having been buried. In this sense, they are like the Northern European prehistoric monuments that the archaeologist Richard Bradley analyzed in trailblazing publications. Or also, like the monumental architecture of pre-Aztec Teotihuacan, which fascinated not just the Spanish colonizers, but also their Aztec imperial predecessors. The rock-cut reliefs and inscriptions of the ancient Near East can be imagined as vortexes, as it were, in which different types of narratives about the past and the present, including those produced by contemporary archaeologists, come together, coexist, and often clash. A stubborn insistence on overvaluing the origins of these monuments fails to recognize their temporal and their spatial, not to mention their sheer material complexity. However handy for those of us who do not happen to live by these reliefs and inscriptions, encyclopedic catalogs have treated them as if they were coins or other portable objects, as if their limits were self-evident and stable and uncontested. As anyone who has studied one of these things knows, it is very, very hard to tell where the monument ends and where whatever is not the monument begins. In the case of the reliefs and inscriptions which I know best, namely those of the Anatolian Bronze Age and Iron Age, rivers, lakes, and mountains are often demonstrably part of the assemblage which the carvings themselves motorize. It is very hard to understand the power of Kizildag if one is not attuned to the momentous seasonal changes that transpire in its surroundings. The reliefs are simply a particularly salient and long-lasting node in a variable network that involved not only natural features, but also men and women with actual bodies, animals, and even arguably the gods. The drawing of the temporal and spatial limits of rock-cut monuments is an ongoing challenge. It never ceases to surprise me, for example, that the monumental corpus of hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions does not mention a Hellenistic Greek text carved directly onto the monument at Kizildag. But by performing these and other acts of exclusion, archaeologists and historians take reliefs out of time, as it were, placing them against an artificial, idealized horizon, which in the case of Kizildag is the Iron and Bronze Age. But those horizons are more our own temporal and political construct than that of the relief. It would seem perverse to argue that we should not be especially interested in the moment of origin of these artifacts, except that the moment of origin is inevitably contested. Reliefs, such as the Neo-Assyrian carving in the Tigris Tunnel, for example, are not so much claiming that the spectacular natural feature was no one's before Tiglath-Pileser I, but rather that the forces that generated the Tigris were under that king's control, that they were to be associated first with the Assyrian king, with Tiglath-Pileser I, then with Shalmaneser III. Rock reliefs are powerful time benders. Let me borrow art historian Alex Nagel's and Christopher Wood's analysis of the work of art to explain some of the ways in which I understand them. According to Nagel and Wood, no device more effectively generates the effect of a doubling or a bending of time than the work of art. But let us replace work of art with rock-cut monument. A strange kind of event whose relationship to time is plural. The rock-cut monument is made or designed by an individual or by a group of individuals at some moment, but it also points away from that moment, backward, to a remote ancestral origin perhaps, or to a prior artifact, or to an origin outside of time in divinity. At the same time, it points forward to all its future recipients who will activate and reactivate it as a meaningful event. This time-bending capacity is arguably nowhere more conspicuous than at Nahr al-Kalb in Lebanon. Any of the rock-cut monuments carved there affect Nagel and Wood's doubling and tripling and quadrupling. The rock-cut relief of Ramses II is a Bronze Age Egyptian artifact, to be sure, but also, inevitably, a Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian Iron Age artifact, and a Greek and Roman artifact, and a Mamluk, Napoleonic, early modern and modern Lebanese artifact. To imagine it as temporally bound at its moment of carving is bizarre. It would be intellectually strange to study the inscriptions of the 14th century AD Mamluk Sultan Barkuk at Nahr al-Kalb without making reference to the many previous inscriptions at the site. It would be equally weird to imagine that with the Lebanese president Emil Lahoud's intervention in the year 2000, which celebrated the departure of Israeli troops from Lebanon, we have happily and finally reached some sort of completion. Sorry, this is Barkuk's inscription, and here are a series of different inscriptions, including the modern ones of 1946 and the year 2000. It may seem contradictory then, if not dishonest, to call attention to the afterlife, specifically to the afterlives of rock-cut monuments. Some of you may rightly ask, what exactly do they come after? Scholars recently have dispensed entirely with the term and decided, for example, to study the lives without further qualification. Paradoxically, however, this book you see on screen is not really concerned with periods before the monuments came into being. So perhaps we can think rock-cut monuments die right then, at the moment of carving. Everything that comes afterward may be considered part of their afterlife. However you may feel about the usefulness of the biographical analogy in the study of objects, the 10 papers you will hear today and tomorrow will deal primarily with moments after that decisive transformation was effected when the chisel hit the stone. Thank you.
Although I have so much to say to my colleague Felipe and to this institution for hosting this, for me, very interesting and exciting conference, I will not say them now because I'm only here today to present the speakers. But I will look for an opportunity to say what I feel tomorrow. Let me begin by inviting the first speaker. So Professor Beate Pongratz-Leisten, Professor of Ancient Near East at the ISO Institute for the Study of the Ancient World in New York. A recent book is Religion and Ideology in Assyria, but many, many others around it, including a volume edited together with Karen Sonic here, Materiality of Divine Agency. I think Beate has been a great inspiration for us all, from her early studies on the Akitu from a while ago, and into her recent explorations of iconography and art history, and even cognitive science together with historical and philological material. So I'm very happy to invite Beate to speak about remote, privileged, in the public eye, the multi-layered messages of rock reliefs in the ancient Near East. This is the opening talk of the conference. Beate, please.
I would like to thank Jonathan and Felipe very much for not only inviting me, but luring me into a topic where I thought I know nothing about. So I just do the files. Okay. In many places nowadays, the modern urban landscape is dominated by commercial advertising. The complex setting of big spaces and high speed has generated a need for big signs that leap into the field of vision and lure the driver into the stores. By means of their sculptural forms and pictorial silhouettes, highway signs and their particular position in space define the megatexture of the landscape. Since their purpose is to produce consumers, their graphic and symbolic meaning can be perceived in a fraction of a second, manipulating the consumer by emotional and visceral appeals in integrating him in a complex web of social status and symbolic meaning. The rock reliefs of the ancient Near East, reaching from Egypt to Iran, are equally signs placed into the landscape, and nonetheless they differ from those of modern advertising. As my paper will demonstrate, they differ in nearly every aspect: placement, content, and purpose. Moreover, ancient rock reliefs are not a uniform category of monuments. While they have been formally interpreted as tokens of landscape control, delineating political borders and visualizing imperial claims, recent research has demonstrated a variety of purposes and proposed more nuanced interpretations. In most, if not all cases, ancient rock reliefs are carved into geographical features of the landscape that have acquired cultural meaning due to their character and their location. Many of the rock monuments are built at or near springs, caves, river gorges, mountain passes, quarries and mining sites, strategic routes, key points on military and trading routes, some of which would have been already frequently visited, in the words of Harman Shah, and culturally significant sites prior to the carving of the rock monuments. This diversity in placement naturally entails diversity in function. Even though not always visible to the people passing by, as an integral part of the landscape, rock reliefs are anchored in the deep history of these sites. While certain locations are marked by the presence of a variety of rulers throughout time, imbuing some places with longevity in the cultural memory, other rock reliefs are clearly political interventions in the landscape, marking the takeover of a formerly untouched landscape and thereby appropriating it into larger networks of domination. Whether such sites were equally locations of pilgrimage or other public actions remain to be determined from case to case. The attribution of cultural meaning and/or the function of marking space does not necessarily imply ritual performance or celebratory gatherings at these particular sites, an association which, to my view, has been attributed too hastily to some monuments. While archaeological field practices, including landscape archaeology, spatial theory, analytical mapmaking technologies, and environmental research have greatly contributed to the spatial and material understanding of places, it is necessary to delve into all available resources, including the epigraphic content of the inscriptions, in order to assess whether beyond their function as markers, rock reliefs functioned as public space, serving particular cultural practices and social memory. The most important criteria for defining public space put forth by Florian Kreppner, namely visibility and accessibility, do not necessarily apply to these locations. Indeed, natural conditions such as inaccessibility or great distances from settlements and thus remoteness from everyday life occur in more than one case. It seems essential to state that although rock reliefs of antiquity might share many features throughout the vast geographical reach between Egypt and Iran, they also differ in essence, form, and function depending on the particular chosen location, and so need to be examined within their geopolitical context. Moreover, many rock reliefs carry inscriptions irrespective of whether they are visible or legible to the passerby, which may add further information to the original intention of or motivation of carving them into the living rock. A glance at the multitude of rock reliefs in Southwest Asia shows that the practice of carving rock reliefs indeed originated in the mountains of western Iran. Interestingly, the first rock reliefs in the ancient Near East are located in the Zagros, on the westernmost ridge of the Iranian plateau. Some date as far back as the 3rd millennium BCE, and while they clearly emulate Akkadian and Trans-Tigridian iconography of the triumphant king as known from Narazim's victory stele, they are nonetheless expressions of local chiefdoms marking their territorial control. Here belong the Shekhan relief, carved into the living rock of a gorge formed by the Abasan River, a tributary to the Diyala. The Darband Igawa relief, located northwest of Shekhan, as well as 4 reliefs, and I only show some of them here, carved into the living rock at Saripol Sohab, approximately 100 kilometers west of Bizutun, which nowadays overlook the courtyard of a school. Here's Saripol Sohab, and here you see one of these reliefs. Only about half the size of a human, the height of these reliefs makes it nearly impossible to recognize any details. Among them, the rock relief of the Lulubi chieftain Anubanini at Saripol Sohab is the best preserved. The relief depicts Anubanini stepping upon the naked body of his enemy. As to his right, Ishtar extends a ring while holding 2 kneeling captives on a leash. The concept of a female warrior goddess witnessing the victory of the king is also known from the Bitmata relief, located even further north, about 70 kilometers northeast of Arbail. This combination of king and goddess in their role as warrior anticipates in its visual representation the idea of Ishtar accompanying the king into battle or even campaigning in his stead, which is known from much later inscriptions and prophecies from the time of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. Although preserved only fragmentarily, the inscription of the Shekhan relief teaches us that the intention of its being carved into the mountain cliff was to propagate the military conquest of the ruler. While the iconic gesture of the king trampling on the naked body of the enemy, all these reliefs with the iconic gesture of the king trampling on the naked body of the enemy, all these reliefs reflect a shared knowledge of the iconic repertoire of the triumphant king that developed during the Akkad period and carried on through the Or-3 period into the Old Babylonian period. The consumption and reuse of this pictorial repertoire over several hundred years reveals an interest in and knowledge of the past insofar as it contributed to the efficacious presencing of the present ruler in his martial and territorial claim and put him in line with his predecessors and historical models such as the kings of Akkad. Like their Hittite counterparts, these early Iranian rock reliefs are completely enmeshed in the natural landscape and barely recognizable to the passers-by. This calls into question whether this kind of presencing was meant to occur in front of a public. While these rock carvings were purposefully placed within the natural environment and so represented deliberate interventions in the landscape, the image was hardly recognizable to the naked eye, and so too was the inscription, which was clearly meant to be seen without being read, at least not by humans, and so must have ultimately aimed to interact with and address the gods. It is rather their overall placement near rivers or ponds as sources of water which is striking and calls for an explanation. Moreover, the combination of 4 reliefs by 4 different rulers in one place at Saripol reveals the intention to make the respective ruler participate in the uppermost elite crowd and the choice of their placement marks a particular significance assigned to this specific place, which could have been represented a way station during a military campaign. In contrast to the rock reliefs of the Iranian chieftains, the ones by the Middle Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser I and the Neo-Assyrian king Shalmaneser III are carved into the caves of the Tigris Tunnel, also known as the source of the Tigris, which is located about 25 kilometers north of the modern city of Lice, north of the Diyarbakir plain. The site features multiple caves, rock outcrops, and gorges known as the Burk Lane cave system, to which belonged the Dibni Su, one of the tributaries of the Tigris. The Dibni Su Valley lies at the heart of the Hurrian kingdom Shubria and is well connected both to the Urartian Lake Van basin and to the Agani Maden, one of the most important copper sources for northern Mesopotamia to the west. Moreover, this area is part of a politically contested region immediately north of the upper Tigris River basin, where the Assyrians carried out an active frontier settlement program in the early Iron Age and controlled agricultural production as well as mining through their regional capital Tushkhan, modern Ziyaret Tepe, in the upper Tigris Valley. Interest in the upper Tigris is attested already under Shamshi-Adad I and Zimrilim, so I'm talking of the first half of the second millennium. During the Middle Assyrian period, that is the time between Shalmaneser and Ashurbanipal, so that's the 13th, 12th century, 11th century, a systematic settlement policy seems to have been pursued, which consisted of a number of dunu, that is fortified sites, that formed part of the urban center of Tushkhan, which later, under Ashurnasirpal II, became the capital of an Assyrian province. And here you see these dunus along the upper Tigris, about 20 kilometers apart from each other. So that's already in the Middle Assyrian period. Moreover, as the military campaigns focus on Shubria, that is the region between the northern Tigris and the Taurus, Urartu, west and north of the Lake Van, and Gilzanu in the region of Hassanlu, so that is west of the Urmia Lake. The military intention was clearly to secure the future trajectories of communication which could be used all year round to allow access to the resources, mainly horses, wood, and metals. The Assyrian motivation for expanding into the upper Tigris region and beyond was thus primarily economic. It is important to note that the area of the Tigris Tunnel itself did not belong to the territory controlled by the Assyrians, which is also demonstrated by the absence of ceramics within a radius of 25 kilometers around the Tigris Tunnel. This, to my view, excludes any kind of repeated commemorative rituals performed by the Assyrians. Rather, it demonstrates that the Assyrians were aware of the fact that in the Hurrian Anatolian worldview, the cave system of the Tigris Tunnel was considered the entry to the netherworld, known in the textual records as Kaskal Kor, and so was symbolically charged. Because they additionally perceived the Tigris Tunnel as the source of the river, these aspects alone might have induced them to attach a particular meaning to this place. This becomes evident from Shalmaneser III's statement that he subdued the territory stretching from the source of the Tigris to the source of the Euphrates, from the sea of the interior land of the land of Samur to the land of Chaldea. The Assyrian perception of the sacredness of the site is reflected in the imagery of the Balawat Gate, which in its 10th band depicts Shalmaneser III's presence at the Tigris Tunnel. In the lower part, the king is shown riding on a horse, so that's on the very left, approaching the cave system where his image is carved into the living rock. The upper part shows offerings performed in front of the cave system and the chiseling of an inscription after dictation read from a clay tablet in the tunnel itself. The fact that the king is dressed in his priestly robe and wears his tiara while riding the horse demonstrates the religious framework of the occasion. With regard to placement, the Assyrian rock carvings in Cave 1 compare to their early Iranian counterparts with regard to their deliberate association with each other. The relief and inscriptions of Shalmaneser III are carved right next to those of Tiglath-Pileser I. The constellation is indeed reinforced by statements in Shalmaneser's annals in which he refers explicitly and repeatedly to Tiglath-Pileser I, not only in the context of the expedition to the Tigris Tunnel, but also in other contexts. However, in contrast to their Iranian counterparts, the Assyrian kings chose a completely different pictorial representation of themselves. Both are represented in profile with the Obana Tarasu gesture, pointing towards their inscriptions. In contrast to the Assyrian steles, which always show the divine presence in form of astral bodies and symbols, in these rock carvings, no divine addressee is represented, although both kings claim that they either went into the region or conquered the region with the help of the gods. Whether this pictorial choice of the absence of the divine was grounded in the fact that the Assyrians were aware that they found themselves outside their cultural horizon and so showed respect for the Anatolian gods of the underworld, or whether this needs to be merely attributed to the fact that Tiglath-Pileser I and Shalmaneser I are the first of their kind in Assyrian art remains an open question. That the gods were thought to be present is indicated by the very gesture of piety of the Assyrian king. It is important to state that all these reliefs were not intended for the public eye. In contrast to his predecessors, for whom the rock relief served as a marker of piety towards the sacredness of a site outside their own cultural horizon, Sennacherib used the same medium to mark the technological achievements of his hydraulic system, which carried water from the Ruba Dohuk, the Bandwai rivers, and the Chines system, all between 50 and 70 kilometers north of Nineveh, to provide for his capital. While the former rock reliefs of Tiglath-Pileser I and Shalmaneser III show the king alone in the poise of addressing the gods without depicting the gods themselves, Sennacherib chose to represent himself standing in between the gods, who, in contrast to the Neo-Assyrian steles, are represented here in human shape. Sennacherib's rock reliefs are carved at the head of canals directly over weirs and overflow installations with a perspective into valleys, and so interact with the natural landscape rather than facilitating visibility for the visitors. In Maltai, they are carved into the face of the steeply rising mountain and are hardly visible from the valley given their small dimensions. A different purpose, again, can be detected in the rock reliefs in the Wadi Brisa and at the Nahal Cape in Lebanon, which figure not only important kings of ancient Near Eastern history, including Egyptian pharaohs, Assyrian and Babylonian kings, but also Roman emperors and a memorial to Napoleon III, though these are different in their intentionality. They were carved into the rock right at the narrow passage crossing the river, and so emphasize the strategic function of the road. By their mere grouping and association, they index the competition of these rulers for dominion in the region, and by their visibility and accessibility, they were clearly aimed at the public eye. It is interesting to note that in this case, as well as in the case of the early Iranian rock reliefs in the Zagros Mountains, the place is appropriated, but the monument itself is not. I would like now to turn to the famous relief of the Persian king Darius at Mount Bisotun in the Kermanshah province of western Iran, dramatically located right before the junction of the roads leading either east to Hamadan and ultimately to today's Turkmenistan, or north towards Tabriz and today's Armenia, marking one of the main east-west routes from the Iranian plateau through the Mesopotamian plain into Anatolia. Darius I's relief is carved about 100 meters high up on the living rock and is therefore again barely visible to the naked eye. Its attraction for our discussion today lies in the extraordinary effort dedicated to the carving of the image and inscriptions, which in this case come in 3 different languages, although none of these would have been visible and even less legible. The image consists of a triumphal depiction of Darius trampling on Gaumata, the originally legitimate successor to the throne, and holding 9 rebels captive on a leash. Above hovers the god Ahura Mazda in a winged disc. The image is framed by 3 inscriptions in Elamite, Akkadian, and Old Persian, which tell the complicated story of Darius' succession to Cambyses as king of Persia, including Cambyses' murder of his brother Bardir before he left for a campaign in Egypt, and with somebody called Gaumata pretending to be Bardir. After Cambyses died far from Persia, Darius claims that he killed Gaumata and ascended to the throne, quelling a series of ensuing revolts. Text and image work in tandem to stress Darius' divine selection by Ahura Mazda and thus to legitimate his usurpation to the throne. Since the early 20th century, scholars have traced the inspiration for Bisotun to the series of carved rock reliefs in the vicinity mentioned at the beginning of my talk that date to the end of the 3rd and beginning of 2nd millennium. In the vein of Margaret Root's approach to the idea of the relief as being guided by a series of calculated allusions to antique traditions, Marian Feldman argues that the appropriation of certain features either from Old Akkadian or Neo-Assyrian iconography was intended to imbue the monument with associations of archetypal power. Again, Darius' rock reliefs would have been barely visible and was clearly meant to engage with the landscape itself, overlooking the plain rather than communicating with the passers-by. Its mere presence sufficed for this end, as Darius I's triumph was not unknown to the contemporary world. According to his inscription, it was circulated through the empire in other media, and indeed an Aramaic papyrus in Elephantine and a relief on the Procession Street in Babylon, which represented an abbreviated version of the carving at Bisotun, survive. Why then the choice of having his ascension to the throne described in 3 different languages, Elamite, Akkadian, and Old Persian? None of the viewers would have been able to read the text. What then is the purpose of inscribing such rock reliefs? It seems indeed that we need to move away from the concept of writing in its communicative function and consider that by its very materiality it was supposed to grant durability to, and by its very presence to authenticate the figural representation. The trilingual was not written with the intention of communicating with the passers-by, though it did constitute a powerful statement of royal control over Elamite as administrative language, over Akkadian as the former diplomatic and now the language of traditional knowledge preserved in the temples of Babylonia, but also used in administrative context, as demonstrated by the fortification tablets from Persepolis, and over Old Persian as the imperial tool of propagating court ideology. Similar to incantations or prayers performed in a foreign language as part of a ritual complex, which was meant to enhance the power of the ritual performance through the creation of a different phonetic experience, the impact of the inscriptions in the rock reliefs primarily came from their mere presence and their monumentality, adding a different kind of material visual experience. Anybody at the time would know that they commented on the figurative image even without being informed of the details. The full meaning of the image only emerges in reference to the text, which could have been performed in speech by a person not necessarily literate, but versed in its history. The clear and unambiguous image of the ruler, either in the pause of speech or trampling on the enemy, was aimed at the visual memory of the viewer. The radical simplification and iconic nature of the image made the transmission of meaning easier, both for the onlooker and for the next artist who will copy it. The remoteness of the figurative image and the written text enhanced the power of the rock relief, simultaneously presencing the king and maintaining his inaccessibility. My examples of rock reliefs were chosen from all over the ancient Near East. They have been carved into places that were landmarks in their own right, even without human interference. As these rock reliefs always materialize the presence of the king in peripheral points of his controlled territory or even beyond, they operate as stand-ins for the king himself, establishing and indexing his satellite presence throughout his empire. This monumentalizing of royal presence, however, was not designed for what we would understand as publicity. In contrast to our modern advertising highway signs, these rock reliefs are not irreverent, as they do not refer to an agent or a place beyond themselves. Rather, they are agents in their own right, interacting with the very location in the landscape where they are placed. As Matthew Canepa put it, the durability of the medium had a special power to imply that whatever vision the reliefs represented, even if it was the claim of a newly minted regime, was as ancient and immutable as the living rock into which it was carved. This ability to transform the contingent and ephemeral into the eternal and natural order of things was the basis of the rock relief's power to forge a permanent link between a dynasty and a site, or a dynasty and an earlier regime that had previously marked the site. End of quote. While rock reliefs were carved in culturally meaningful places that could even be politically contested, and while a ritual might have been performed there at the moment when they were finished, as is the case with the relief of Shalmaneser III at the Tigris Tunnel, they are not necessarily commemorative in nature. In contrast to our modern monuments of war, they are not lieux de mémoire, as they were defined originally by Pierre Nora. Lieux de mémoire function as crystallizing points either to memorize or to commemorate in particular celebrations a particular historical event for a collective. Over time, such sites could be appropriated by different kinds of groups for particular purposes. Such is the case with the Warsaw Ghetto Monument that was erected to mark both the heroism of Jewish resistance to the Nazis and the complete annihilation of the Jews in Warsaw. It is now a gathering place for Polish war veterans, as well as for the Jews, and the square where it is placed has been turned into a square of solidarity and other dissident groups who have turned it into a performance space for protests. In other words, lieux de mémoire are for the people. They are visible and accessible. They do not engage with the landscape around them in the way rock reliefs do. Irma Hermann-Scher is certainly right in his critique that rock reliefs should not be investigated as stand-alone monuments, as formerly done in art historical and epigraphic approaches. However, as they might form part of a complex assemblage in the microgeographical context of the history of a particular place, as he illustrates through a choice of Anatolian examples, we must distinguish between monuments created at a spring that might have a ritual function, such as Eflatun Pinar, for instance, and rock reliefs which, due to their inaccessibility and often near invisibility, had a different purpose. They served as markers of territorial control and so belonged to what Matthew Canepa has coined as technologies of power. This notion of technology of power, however, needs to be clearly defined, as it does not necessarily include publicity. As I have demonstrated in my recent book on religion and ideology in Assyria, royal ideology deemed it essential to respond to the cultural expectation as framed by the ancient worldview, namely that the king had properly acted in order to maintain the social and cosmic order. Archaeological evidence teaches us that because such statements were primarily addressed to the gods and their successors, they did not need to be public, but could be written instead on prisms or other artifacts that were buried in the foundations of either the temple or the palace. As demonstrated by monuments like the Trajan column in Rome, the inscriptions high up in the ceiling in the octagonal circular passage of the Dome of the Rock, or Napoleon's Colonne Vendôme in Paris, monuments can be public and executed with the greatest diligence regarding their imagery and inscriptions without being visible and legible in detail. In all the ancient Near Eastern examples I discussed today, writing transcends its function of conveying information and circulating knowledge. Rather, it was meant to enhance the content of the image. Rather than being objects of ritual, the ancient Eastern rock reliefs have a ritualizing and sacralizing effect themselves, inscribing themselves into the landscape, and thereby not only taking control, but incorporating untamed nature into the orbit of cosmic order by their very presence, as these sites as satellite locations index the king's presence and so become integrated into his realm of control. As this conference is concerned with the longevity of places in the social memory, it seems vital to me to distinguish between sites such as Nahr el-Kalb, which was located in a politically contested region and at a pass difficult to cross, and so claimed by many parties throughout history, healing places such as Eflatun Pinar, which were both visible and accessible to people, and rock reliefs of the kind I have been discussing in my paper today. Thank you. Did I go too long?
We'll take questions after the second
Yes.
talk.
Okay.
We'll take questions after the second talk, as we've done in previous versions of this thing.
Okay.
Valeria.
Okay. I'm happy to invite the second speaker, Valeria Serguenkova, please. University of Cincinnati Department of Classics. Valeria has earned her PhD at Harvard in 2009. She is interested in the interface of science and history, mainly in classical literature. Her interest is in medicine, in cartography, ethnography, scientific illustrations. She keeps, although working in the classics, she keeps an open eye on the ancient Near East and has published a series of articles together with our friend Felipe here. So I am happy to call on Felipe and Valeria together to present a joint research with the title the limits of reliefs. Now, how are you going to do it? I don't know.
My lady's going to do it, but
Yeah.
I'm going to.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan and Felipe, for having me, and thanks for the introduction. The powerful insight of Akira Kurosawa's 1950 masterpiece Rashomon has never been fully appreciated by scholars of ancient Near Eastern rocket monuments. This is a pity. The film famously uses a plot device in which different characters tell alternative, in fact conflicting stories of the same incident, or the conflicting versions. They're all labeled by as stories: the story of the bandit, the story of the woodsman, and so on. So at odds are these stories that the very idea of proof, in fact, becomes suspect. The narrative strategy used in the movie is now cliched, of course, and its overuse in film and TV and literature has been dubbed the Rashomon effect. Before insisting that archaeologists and historians may benefit from Hollywood's ploys, let me begin by stating briefly our goals in this paper. We aim first to provide a brief account of what we consider some exciting recent trends in the study of the afterlives of rocket monuments. Second, to offer some methodological reflections about how to study such monuments. And third, to present a detailed analysis of one of them, the so-called Charonion on the outskirts of ancient Antioch and Orontes in Syria, modern Antakya in Turkey. These are exciting days for scholars working on Near Eastern rock cut reliefs and inscriptions. In recent years, archaeologists, historians, and art historians, in the classes too, specializing in different regions and periods, including several sitting in this room, have pushed their study in new and challenging directions. Today, we'd like to call attention to three overarching themes that have become prominent in very recent scholarship. At the same time, however, we would like to point out some potential pitfalls and to suggest how we may perhaps avoid them. So we would like to highlight three themes that are distinguished here as temporality, ontology, and politics, but they are in fact interrelated. So by temporality, we mean more specifically the desire to acknowledge and explore the multi-temporality of rock-cut monuments. That is, the fact that they are never really of a single time. By ontology, we mean, less opaquely, the challenge of studying conceptions of landscape that do not accord with modern Western culture, nature, ideas, and the divide between them. And with politics, we are especially thinking of the call to attend to the voices of marginalized interpreters. So, as regards temporality, various scholars, including Matt Canepa and Omer Harmansah, have demonstrated the virtues of studying the long-term biographies of rock-cut monuments. Professor Canepa, for example, has elucidated the sophisticated strategies of Iranian rulers who commissioned reliefs and inscriptions in order to mobilize not only the monuments of their predecessors, but also entire landscapes of ritual, what he termed topographies of power. On his part, Harmansah declared, quote, "rock reliefs are never finished," end quote. Therefore, he argues, only a holistic multi-temporal approach, one which does not privilege the moment of carving, can come close to unraveling their varied impact, especially their impact among the people who have lived in the areas where they're located. Now, two potential risks of this insistence on multi-temporality are that of homogenizing all types of later interaction, and that of falling into a kind of post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. For example, by overvaluing alleged continuities, seeing continuities where perhaps they're not. Omer, for example, claimed that the Lakota Sioux's understanding of the sacrality of the Black Hills of South Dakota, better known today as Mount Rushmore, was somehow resonant in the carving of the colossal heads of the US presidents. Now, surely this sacrality was and continues to be resonant for the indigenous people of the area. But we have doubts whether Gutzon Borglum and his Masons cared at all about the Lakota Sioux about what the Lakota Sioux Indians thought about the place that they called Six Grandfathers. It seems that Borglum and the settlers before him truly proceeded as if what they called Mount Rushmore was nobody's. Their neglect, willful or not, is indirectly attested by the profusion of names that the settlers gave the topographic feature. Cougar Mountain, Sugarloaf Mountain, Slaughterhouse Mountain, Keystone Cliffs, among others. Now, there's no way to know what narratives will resonate in Mount Rushmore in 100 years, much less in 500,000. Like Matthew Buckingham's idyllic vision, which you see on screen, is probably over-hopeful. Now, going to ontology, Ömür and Felipe, among others, have made attempts to attend to distinctly Anatolian ontologies of landscape. Wow. It's almost like it was a setup, the ontology of this room. Ömür has called, for example, has claimed, for example, that many Hittite rock reliefs are, at their core, the monumentalized record of numinous apparitions. As other scholars have noted, reliefs are frequently located in caves, springs, and other such salient natural places. He has further argued that the sites of the monuments were effectively portals between the realms of the human and the divine. He's even compared them to later chapels dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Independently, Felipe has tried to trace Anatolian traditions according to which kings in Lydia were genetically related to lakes. He's right, these traditions date back to the Bronze Age and last well into the Roman period. The epistemological problems of exploring ontologies of landscape that do not accord with those of modern science are, to put it mildly, legion. Much of the relevant literature on the subject of alternative ontologies has been produced by scholars working in the Amazon who have access to living informants. Now, we know that blood is the beer of the jaguar because an Amazonian Indian told as much to the anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro. Scholars of ancient Anatolia don't have the option of asking the Hittite king Suppiluliuma whether he was in fact genetically related to a pure lake or whether he recognized the mountains by which he swore as living sentient beings. And finally, a few words about politics. Traditionally, when scholars of rapid monuments have confronted issues of politics and ideology, they have largely focused on the original intentions of the monarchs or generals who commissioned them. These monuments have thus been explained frequently, regularly, as tools of imperialist enterprises, and even post-colonial approaches, which have tended to prioritize the perspective of the non-generals and non-monarchs, have tended to make power the chief interpretive framework of analysis. Recent research combining digital quantitative methods and contemporary sociological theories has added nuance to the variety of ancient actors involved in the use of reliefs to make political claims over territories. Claudia Glatz and Emmet Poort, for example, argued that the rock-cut monuments of the Hittite Bronze Age should be understood not solely as monuments of the Hittites who ruled from Hattusha, but rather, on occasion, as the defiant contestations of princes and rival kings living in the periphery of empire. And the map on screen synthesizes some of their conclusions. When the search for alternative voices is conducted diachronically, as we're doing in this conference, our investigation becomes much more challenging and also much more interesting because the number and variety of speakers and interpreters multiplies with dizzying effect. Felipe and I have investigated what a host of Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and Ottoman period interpreters thought about and did with the rock-cut monuments of Bronze and Iron Age Anatolia. You see an example of one such monument at Fasılar in Turkey. Post-colonial approaches and politically engaged archaeologists have emphasized the need to recover the opinions of ancient and modern indigenous interpreters in particular. Now, we sympathize in principle, of course, but we have some reservations. Attempts to attend to marginalized voices are often carried out by retrojecting modern distinctions into the past. In our opinion, dialogue and cross-pollination among different interpreters and communities of interpreters is much more common than many modern analyses acknowledge. the marginalized and the elite, the local and the translocal, the colonized and the colonizer often came together at the site of rock release. Came together not as in, what's the expression, like kumbaya, but they did, they did literally, I think, come together demonstrably in some cases. As we have argued, the distance between experts and what the Greeks called idiots in antiquity was simply not as great as it is now. Now, let me return to Rashomon and the possibility that the study of rock cut monuments could benefit from different narrative strategies than those usually adopted in their study. The film scholar Robert Anderson has described the Rashomon effect as being, quote, not only about differences in perspective, but about such differences when they arise in combination with the absence of evidence to elevate or disqualify any version of the truth. Plus, the social pressure for closure on the question, end quote. Now, that is precisely the situation in which archaeologists and historians interested in both the lives and the afterlives of rock cut monuments find themselves. Fragmented, episodic approaches in the academic analysis of ancient monuments have proved useful before. In a brilliant article published in the Journal of Mediterranean Archaeology, Glasses Grant Parker demonstrated the virtues of challenging linear past-to-present narratives. He offered a counter-diachronic object biography, starting from the present, of the granite obelisk which now stands in Piazza Navona in Rome. Following the narrative logic of films such as Irreversible, Benjamin Button, if you want to continue with the movie analogies. The most obvious achievements of his contribution are, on the one hand, wresting importance away from the moment of origin of a monument, and on the other, calling attention to the common confusion of temporal anteriority with cause, that is, the finding of continuities where there are perhaps none. So what we propose to do, and what follows, is to approach the Charonion Rashomon style. This carving is well suited to this type of investigation because the interest in focusing exclusively on original agents, motives, and intentions seems to us, at least in the case of this monument, to have reached a kind of an impasse. In fact, this obsession with the monument's prime cause, as it were, has obscured not only its variable meanings and relevance over millennia, but also the lasting importance of Anatolian and more specifically Antiochian ideas about the power of mountains and stone. An anonymous Arabic language manuscript description of Antioch of indeterminate date survives in two slightly different copies in the Vatican and in the Bodleian libraries. The description belongs to a literary tradition that treats antiquities as part of a magical system of knowledge. It deals briefly with the historical origins of the city and at greater length with its various buildings, landmarks, and especially talismans. After discussing many of the talismans within the city proper, the author goes on to describe a rock-cut monument at the outskirts of Antioch as follows. Outside the city walls, there is a sculpted rock which is an idol called Al-Bakia, the Wailing Woman. The text then goes on to discuss a ritual performed by women involving water and the burning of incense, intended to activate the sculpted rock's healing powers over sick children. For the author of the manuscript, the idol was unmistakably female. The text was edited and published only at the very end of the 19th century, and it took scholars a few decades to recognize that the description seems to refer to the colossal bust carved on the southern slopes of Mount Silpion, just outside of the ancient city of Antioch. Now, many Muslim authors, like their Byzantine predecessors and contemporaries, were keenly interested in the talismanic power of pre-Islamic and pre-Byzantine artifacts. Their concerns and reflections and speculations have occasionally been dismissed by modern scholars as superstitions that cloud the original meaning and function of the antiquities in which they were interested. More sympathetic readers have understood Islamic and Byzantine reflections of the magical power of ancient realia differently. Art historian Barry Flood, for example, interprets them as an attempt to, quote, impose an order on potentially threatening vestiges of the past, or to reorder politically problematic instantiations of the present, end quote. After all, according to the author of our Arabic text, The former grandeur of Antioch was owed to the fact that its founder, Antiochus, was a megalomaniacal idol worshipper. Thus, the ancient monuments in the city could be explained as the still powerful traces of an idolatrous tyrant. We know virtually nothing about the author's identity, but his description is merely one instantiation of a tradition extant in both Arabic and Turkish, and arguably ultimately based on a Syriac, perhaps even Greek predecessor, dealing with the talismans of Antioch. In fact, the great 17th century Ottoman geographer Katib Çelebi, whose mention of the Syro-Hittite reliefs in Ivris we've discussed elsewhere, also reflected on the meaning of Antioch's own monuments, including the Wailing Woman in the rocks. Now, the rock-cut face on Mount Silpion and its power over the people of Antioch since at least exerted its power over the people of Antioch since at least the early Byzantine period. The Antiochians nicknamed the monument the Heronion, that is, the place of Haron, the boatman of the underworld in Greek mythology. The moniker was current in the 6th century CE, when John Malalas, a native of the city and the author of a famous history of the world, starting with creation, ending with the reign of Justinian, Malalas is on time, described it in a few sentences. According to him, the monument was carved in the 2nd century BCE by under the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the city's erratic but very lavish benefactor who built a whole new quarter just beneath where the relief is at the foot of the mountain, and who financed all kinds of lavish and spectacular projects. As Malalas tells it, the face was carved into the living rock as a colossal apotropaic device at the instigation of a talisman maker by the name of Laius. Here's what he says. During Antiochus' reign, when there was a plague and many people in the city perished, Laius, a wonder worker, ordered that a rock from the mountain above the city be carved with an enormous mask, crowned and looking towards the city and the gorge. He wrote something on it and stopped the deaths from the plague. To the present day, the Antiochians call this mask Charonion. Now, the same tradition is reflected in the work of the 12th century CE poet and grammarian John Tzetzes, who almost certainly gleaned this knowledge from literary accounts rather than from personal observation, unlike Malalas. In fact, Tzetzes was not much interested in the Charonion itself, but rather in the achievements of Laius, the wonder worker, whom he in fact called Laius. And Laius or Laius, the name of this guy seems designed by Malalas or Tzetzes or maybe the talisman maker himself to recall the name of another man in a similar epidemic pickle, Oedipus's father Laius in Greek myth, who also faced a plague in his city Thebes in Greece, in that case famously inflicted by a sphinx. At any rate, Tzetzes invoked Laius several times in his learned poetry, always in the context of a list of various figures from ancient Greek history and myth who were credited with averting natural disasters and conquering death and disease and so on. Now, perhaps the most significant detail in Malalas' account concerns the fact that the rock-cut face is in fact an active spectator, forever looking down from its mountain perch over the city and the gorge. And the gorge you can't really see, but it's this cleft on the left side of the screen, obviously, in the mountain. Now, the gorge in question must be the cleft in the mountain through which a destructive winter stream, as we hear in Malalas himself and other sources, occasionally flooded the quarter of the city built up by Antiochus. From the Hellenistic period to at least the reign of Theodosius in the 1st century CE, various rulers, in fact, attempted to tame the waters of this stream by constructing aqueducts and sluice gates. I'll come back to the voyeuristic nature of the stone in a minute, but now moving on to another set of stories, the explorers' stories. Many Western European travelers passed through Antioch and left written accounts of their visits. There are at least 50 separate accounts between the 12th and the 18th century alone. However, the earliest account of Charonion that is unmistakably based on on personal observation and actual visit does not appear until the publication of the findings of the expedition for the surveying of the rivers Euphrates and Tigris carried out by the British government in the 1830s. Francis Rawdon Chesney, the general and explorer most famous for his involvement in the Suez Canal project, penned the following brief note in his 4-volume report of the expedition he headed. This is what he says. At no great distance above the gate of St. Paul are the ancient excavations forming part of the Church of St. John, and in the vicinity a colossal head, probably that of a sphinx. Also a full-length Egyptian figure, both in bold relief, cut in the solid rock, evidently at a very remote period. Now, as far as we know, this is the first mention of the smaller scale anthropomorphic figure hovering over the right shoulder of the bust, which the general confidently identified as Egyptian. In fact, Chesney, that is, who had spent time in Egypt exploring the possibility of building the Suez Canal, was not alone in referring to the Charonion as a sphinx, or generally in relating all colossal carvings in the Near East to Egypt. So, for instance, the surgeon and geologist attached to the expedition headed by Chesney, when William Francis Ainsworth described the winged bulls of Persepolis as sphinxes, quote, transmitted from the original sphinx at the foot of the pyramids, quote. Ainsworth also wrote an account of his travels with the Euphrates expedition and recording his thoughts on the Charonion, more length in general. Here's what he says. In the vicinity of the grotto churches of St. Paul and St. James, at the former of which we buried Sergeant Sim, are to be found traces of a colossal head, apparently of a sphinx, as also of a full-length figure, both in bold relief, cut in solid rock and belonging apparently to Assyrian times. Some, however, have associated them with the connection between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and others have suggested that the grottos were the tombs of some of the Egyptian princesses who were wedded to the kings of Antioch before they became Christian chapels, the grottos, that is. But they appear to date back to periods long before these. Now, at this point, it may be worth remembering that Rashomon's powerful multivocality was achieved not only by telling the same story from different characters' perspectives, but also by the fact that Kurosawa filmed many of the scenes using multiple cameras at the same time. At any rate, Ainsworth's account is remarkable for the abundance of alternative theories it presents in so brief a space. Whoever his sources were, he was convinced that the monument was much more ancient than the Hellenistic period and that it was Egyptian in some sense. What he and perhaps the rest of the British Imperial expedition made of the meaning of the Antioch Sphinx is never stated explicitly, but to judge from his comments on the Persepolis sphinxes, all later sphinxes were, quote, only afterthoughts. The original sphinx unquestionably represented the unity of the Godhead. Now, several other ideas were advanced with varying degrees of confidence by various Western explorers who speculated that the figures were both male or female, Chore Persephone perhaps, or Mithras and Attis, and then either Hellenistic or Roman or more ancient date, all in the space of the rest of the 19th century. But they were all sort of swept to the side by the authoritative 2-page report on the Charonion by G.W. Elderkin, who excavated Antioch with Princeton in the 1930s. Now, 2 pages with 3 very large photographs, but seems it was the final word. Now, Elderkin reconstructed with impressive certainty what the testimony of Malalas actually meant. Namely, the bust had been left unfinished because the plague stopped as soon as Laios, the talisman maker, had inscribed his magical words. Elderkin even discovered what Laios had inscribed based on a kind of loose analogy with the inscription reported by Malalas that was inscribed on a different talisman in Antioch much later. And he even speculated what the location of the inscription had been, the chest, before, quote, being destroyed by the fanatics. Elderkin also identified the gorge mentioned by Malalas as the aqueduct that the Princeton expedition had found passed below and before the image, as he put it. And you see his illustration of the entrance of that aqueduct on screen. According to him, the Byzantine nickname, the Charonion, was due to the belief in the 6th century that the bust was that of a chthonic or earth goddess who had been appeased and stopped, as he puts it, who stopped the affliction which sent many souls to Haran, quoting Homer's Iliad. The goddess in question, he proposed, was the Syrian goddess whose sanctuary Hierapolis was believed in the Roman period to have been built by the wife of Seleucus I, the founder of Antioch. Citing the Hittite associations of the Syrian goddess, Elderkin concluded the Hittite tradition of carving in living rock the figure of their nature goddess seems to have survived in the Charonion at Antioch. Now, it would be disappointing if our invocation of Rashomon was limited simply to our insistence on multivocality. There have been examples of experiments with that approach. I'm thinking of classes John Ma's Black Hunter variations, or archaeologist Rosemary Joyce's the languages of archaeology. Another aspect, however, that Rashomon is generally praised for is the care with which Kurosawa captured light throughout the film. In fact, in the film, light is almost a character in itself, and it's clear that Kurosawa exerted himself to capture how the many variations of light affect the protagonist of the story. And I was just thinking about this a couple hours ago. It's not just light, it's also wind, and in fact the bandit story begins with the bandit saying, "It was the cool breeze that made me do it." And if you watch the movie, you see that the patterns of light and dark go hand in hand with sudden gusts of wind, or breeze, I guess. Anyways, what we're trying to say is perhaps it's possible to attend to the story of the stone, the Charonion, in the same way as Kurosawa attended to the role of light and wind. Now, let me say explicitly that what we're doing here is not playing with perspectivism. We're not trying to narrate what the stone itself sort of thought or felt, though I would love to see someone smarter than us try it. What we're interested in is in telling the story of what the Charonion, qua stone and qua mountain shaped by the awesome power of water, presumably, might have meant for the people at Antioch at various times. Now, in addition to the mask and the smaller female or male figure on its shoulder, there are abundant niches carved around the Charonion, presumably to make votive offerings. In fact, the whole area around the carvings has been used by different communities to bury their dead. An early modern Armenian cemetery existed there in the 19th century, and Elderkin excavated Roman period tombs almost adjacent to the relief. In addition, just below the Charonion is a famous rock church, famously connected to St. Peter, which further highlights the sacred character of the whole place. Many of the textual sources concentrate, in fact, most of them exclusively concentrate on the face, the giant face, at the expense of the other features around it, even at the expense of the smaller, full-size figure. And this is a common problem for anyone interested in rock reliefs and moment relief from any period. Where do they begin and where do they end? Is it just a face, or is it the face and the figure, or the face and the figure and the niches, or the face and the figure and the niches and the aqueduct, and so on? So let me return to what I described a moment ago as the voyeuristic nature of the face, or the mask, as Malalas called it. Other carvings in the landscape around the sprawling city of Antioch attest to the fact that the stones around Antioch did a lot of looking. A magic eye, for example, carved inside an incised square near the entrance of the so-called Tunnel of Titus, seems to be a talisman protecting the tunnel, I think, against the force of the water channeled inside it. Or perhaps the eye is looking up to the line above it, which has been interpreted as a high water mark This nearly 1.5 kilometer long tunnel runs through solid rock in order to divert water of a river which kept silting up the harbor of Antioch's sister city and main port, Seleucia Pieria. This ambitious project was undertaken by Vespasian and his son Titus, as the inscription you see here on the screen, located very near the eye, states. But it was not, in fact, completed until the time, the reign of Antoninus Pius, who inscribed his achievement at the opposite end of the tunnel. An even more remarkable case of powerful stones mobilized to spy upon the city and its people, to look and be looked at, can be found in the nearby monastery of St. Simeon the Stylite the Younger. The complex has often been described as a slightly smaller replica of the monastery of his namesake in modern Syria, the Kalat Saman. But this explanation misses a very important aspect of the grounding of the monastery in Antioch. Many of its walls, and critically the column on which St. Simeon stood, were carved out of the living rock to harness the power of Samandat, or the Holy Mountain, as the place is now known. The Antiochians' pride in their holy mountains is attested in other media from the Byzantine period, including mosaics and statuettes, that insist on identifying the city partly through its mountainous setting. The Heronion, wherever it was carved, is tapping into a long local tradition of peeping mountains that had particularly strong roots in Antioch. So where does our experiment with narrative leaves us? While I'm not sure we avoided all of the pitfalls which we think attend the exciting new approaches that scholarship on reliefs has engaged in, I think we have learned something. Even if the selective episodic presentation we use instead of the standard unified linear narrative is really only a difference of emphasis rather than in absolute terms, as even Grant Parker conceded for his counter-diachronic presentation of the history of the Piazza Navona obelisk. I think there's something to be gotten out of this format of narrating the story of a relief, especially a relief such as this one. We have probably not made progress in ascertaining who the Heronion was designed to represent. But we do think we understand better why it is where it is. Now, unlike Kurosawa, we're absolutely not suggesting that the very idea of truth is suspect, but if this presentation has succeeded in demonstrating anything, it is that in cases such as the Heronion, where different interpreters, some of them even in this room, continue to tell different stories about who or what the stone shows, then a relief, as Omer Harmansah claims, really is never finished. Thank you.
Perhaps we could take 2 or 3 questions for both speakers, if there are any.
I have more of a comment for Beata's presentation. First of all, congratulations. It was very, very comprehensive, and you brought in many different elements, but I was a little disappointed with the images of Las Vegas, because you ended up pointing out that they were irrelevant anyway, as I understood it. And there are some good examples. Mount Rushmore, the Indian mountain carving that's still underway nearby, and more recently, the carving of Martin Luther King in Atlanta, which I think are all more or less commemorative, and therefore much better parallels than images of Las Vegas.
I wasn't aiming for comparison rather than antagonism. And coming from Europe, you know, these advertisement signs here in the landscape are really aggressive to me. So, and what I wanted to point out, and what my talk was really about, was that visibility doesn't mean necessarily legibility or even, you know, accessibility to the passers-by. So that was my point. I didn't want to make a point about commemoration. That was rather at the end with the understanding of lieu de mémoire, but not with the Las Vegas example. That was really, an antagonism I wanted to point out right at the beginning, because they draw the passers-by right in, while many rock reliefs cannot be seen with the naked eye. So that was my opposition I wanted.
Thank you.
I have a question about legibility and accessibility, actually. I wonder, what do you think about the case of Bisutoon, for example, where even if the monument is not legible in the modern conventional sense of the word, it was clearly noticed and noticeable in antiquity. So does that not count for more? Is that not really communication? That the kind of communication
But it's not communication necessarily about the content of the inscription. It's communication about the presencing of Darius in this area. It might even evoke, because people knew about his campaigns, the defeat of the revolts. But it's not what I wanted to get at. It's as you can't read the inscription, it's not about information, about detailed information. Writing in this context has a different meaning, as it does in medieval ornamental writing, in Arabic calligraphy. Yeah, so this is not to be read at the very moment you see it in 1 second. Either you can decode it with great care over time, but that's not the intention. So writing has a different meaning from conveying direct information.
Even as it
Yes,
even as you allow it, it does have communicative
I think the interesting thing is
function.
you couldn't even see that it was Akkadian and Elamite and Old Persian. It's far too high up. You can't see that anymore.
Agree.
So, but nonetheless, they want to make the statement.
I'm asking the two of you, because it does relate to, I guess, the two of you. I'm thinking of Nar el-Kalb, so that place that really attracted many subsequent generations of carvings. So when I think it was in the conference poster, or in one of the articles I read today preparing, when there is just next to the Egyptian, to the Ramses relief, comes an Assyrian king.
Yes.
Just
Yes,
next to it.
Yes.
Just next to it.
Yeah,
You've shown
yeah,
that.
yeah.
So what is he trying to gain? Is he trying to pull some power from the earlier king and you make it of his own use? What's the idea in that?
Yeah, I think, I make the comparison between the early Iranian and Nahr el-Kalb, and both because of their constellation with other earlier reliefs. That is exactly, they put themselves into a line of former rulers making a claim of the territory. Yeah, so that's very different from the Darius relief.
I think both speakers. I'm a member of Felipe's seminar currently, and one thing we've been talking about is this very issue of lives versus afterlives. So I guess this is one thing that I'd like to ask either speakers. Is there a way to talk about lives, but also taking into account that the first inscription, that the first time that these mines were chiseled out, that seems to have some kind of specialness, that seems to be in some way different. So is there a way to demarcate the first instance without saying that the monument dies after that, and that what happens afterwards is just an afterlife?
Well, I think you can jump in. I think what your question shows is the limits of this biological metaphor. The life of an object, the biography of an object. So it becomes a little bit have an argument about how we use words and what we designate with them. So I think from a practical point of view, this separating line between the life and the afterlife is not going to be anything but a matter of kind of point of view and choice. And so I think the afterlife really is part of the life. And so it sounds a little bit nonsensical once you start thinking through the full implications of such a statement if you're really wedded to the biological analogy at the beginning. I would agree with you that the initial inscriptions of the birth and whether the death is coinciding or maybe a nanosecond away from that, I don't know, it carries special importance, as you said, but I do think that in many cases, including the one that I was talking about, Charonion, it's actually the hardest one to say anything about that is not basically the result of your sort of historical circumstances and agenda. And so the afterlife is much richer than the life or birth moment. And I think that alone is a reason to promote or elevate the status of the afterlife period, afterlife a little bit higher.
Perhaps we could take one more question if there is one more question. Matt?
Yeah, I just sort of comment on both of these monuments. In some ways, the Charonion and Bisitun, just because we were returning to that, are very rich because they're inaccessible. And they're inaccessible because we don't have the textual evidence that we can, as sort of positivist historians, perhaps we can reconstruct the real meaning. But Bisitun is also distant from us, and some of the methods that one goes about manipulating and changing it in this sort of the continuing life of the monument is either by destroying it or reinterpreting it. And when they're inaccessible up on the cliffside with Bisitun, what did the sluices do? At least in my opinion, they injected a new narrative and a new interpretation, with kind of our sense of agents like Berosus, and we see reflected in Diodorus. So the monument itself is still in pristine condition relatively, but it's disconnected, and now it's Semiramis, a woman rather than a king, and something that is not Persian and somewhat sort of shameful. And the Charonion, we have this similar sort of overlay, but also that kind of sort of continued mythologizing, but I don't know if it's necessarily pernicious in that sense. But I'm just kind of struck by the sort of parallel between the two cases.
Felipe, can I follow up on this? Another thought that I had. So the idea that the lack of accessibility is because of, at least for some rock monuments, it's because of they are meant for supernatural readers. That's already one of the bases, for example, of Mathias, Il Maestro e l'Opera. I wonder whether in historically based situation of strong disputes, the decision of secluding and saving, so put out of the space where the dispute can be played, not just for posterity, but for some generation to come, when the episode will no more be so decisive. Whether in these cases this might also be a reason. So in order to narrate what's written, as you said, they might have been people presenting it, reading from text, as the example you showed from the papyri and so on. But that would save a version of Darius that could not be assessed and therefore could much more easily remain. And then whether it remains in the tradition or not, in the end depends, how about biography, on the evolution of the political situation, on the success or not of the producer. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, we know that reliefs were exposed to mutilation, right? So very often, either steles or reliefs have these mutilated eyes, ears, whatever. So already the choice to go high up would save the monument for from this kind of intervention. And yeah, so I think, that is a particular, but to me it's also something else, and I think something which really needs to be thought about much more intensely is that it is indexing the king's presence, but it's always, at least for the Assyrian cases or for the Iranian cases, or I would say especially for the Assyrian ones, it is very much at the periphery of their realm, unless we get to Sennacherib, where we are about a technological statement. Yeah, that's different. But it is engaging with nature. So the point I wanted to make is it's ritualizing in the effect that the king is represented in the piety gesture of addressing the gods, as he is represented normally in steles at the gates or somewhere else. So you get somehow an extension of what is the cultic, cosmic, ordered space within the city. You get it transplanted into untamed nature as a statement. Yeah? And that to me is just an extraordinary choice. Yeah? So I don't need human rituals in order to enhance that. Do you see what I want to say in this case? It's different from Eflatun Pinar or other places. Yeah, in this case, I don't need a ritual in order to enhance this statement. It's there, and I would say it doesn't have life or afterlife. It's eternal. Yeah. If you understand the image.
Perhaps we could thank Beate and Valeria again.